Hello and good morning. Thank you for joining us for Sunrise Extra on this Monday. We have all been through quite the weekend. I just cannot emphasize the history that we are living through right now is just mind-blowing. We're in a pandemic, we're in an economic recession, depression, and now we are going through this this weekend once again. And we want to welcome a very special guest with us this morning, Reverend E.D. Mondaine, the president for the past 3 years of the Portland NAACP chapter, waking up with us early. Thank you so much for joining us. As you wake up this morning, what are your kind of thoughts from over the weekend of seeing your city, rally in both peaceful protests that were largely peaceful to, some of the violence and destruction that we saw late into the evening? How are you feeling this morning, Reverend?
I'm feeling a little sorrow. I'm feeling rather saddened by the entire situation. However, I do feel optimistic. I feel that we have some very good times ahead of us. These are just temporary times, and we're dealing with temporary situations. This rioting won't last forever, but I think that it's embarked us upon a path that we ought to be on that's towards solutions, and I believe that we're ready to go there.
What's a real change, Reverend, in your opinion? Like something that we can kind of put our finger on, a real change that you would like to see happen, that you think could happen based on what we're watching over the course of the past few days? Because you say that this is not forever. This is what we're seeing right now is temporary. But what are some of the changes that you think will and should happen?
Well, some of the changes that need to happen, first of all, is communication in terms of what started this ugly monster in the first place. What systemic rationalizations, legislations, and procedures have to be immediately put on the table and discussed right away as to how we can see some immediate changes. What those are in terms of what order they're in and how we get to that point, I don't know. However, we have to start with having the conversation of what do we do next, in the legislature, and what do we do next in terms of good faith and changing some laws right now?
Yeah, that's a good point. I have a little bit different perspective. My parents were biracial, my father black, my mother white. She had a brother that did not speak to her for 25 years because she married a black man in 1963. Our family has come together. Those wounds actually did heal. I've seen it firsthand in my own life with people from different backgrounds finally making peace, although it took almost a lifetime in some cases. The thing that really did strike me as you spoke over the last few days was to dive into your own family and to talk about racism and to, I guess, call people out, your own relatives. I know we sometimes cringe and joke about, oh my gosh, I got to go to the Thanksgiving dinner table. It's already awkward. And then you add race into it. What are you actually looking toward? What do you think about, and how does that play out, like really practically, if we're going to be talking to our relatives about race?
You have to hit it head on. You have to call a spade a spade. You have to say what it is. You have to bring up the hard topics. What do you think about black people? What do you think about interracial equality? What do you think about what's happening in this country? And do you think that it's okay? We have to start there. We have to start at the dinner table. We have to start with our children. We have to start with our colleagues at work. We have to, you say different things. I remember a movie where a man took the identity of a black man for a week. I think it was called Watermelon Man. And those conversations that we have in private look a lot different than we have in public. You know what you say behind closed doors. In my presence, you can't use the words cracker, redneck, etc., because I'll stop you and say, wait a minute, who are you talking about and why? We have to be very stern about how we allow our spaces to look like, and we can control that.
Do you also agree or disagree that we need to accept and embrace allies no matter where they come from. I think sometimes it's difficult for people, whether it be, let's just say for the sake of argument, white people who want to weigh in on this. And then somebody on the other side says, well, what would you know about that? Or, why are you even weighing in on this? Because you don't live this, you don't have my experience. Don't you think that we have to really change the conversation and perhaps at times, when appropriate, give grace to people who truly don't know? When I use the word ignorance, I mean that in the clinical definition of they don't know, because that they don't have any experience. I'm kind of bumbling around, but does that make sense to you?
Of course it does. Social cognitive implicit bias. When we don't put it in context, we often talk about implicit bias, but when we don't put it into context, social cognitive. Where did you grow up and what were those experiences? That's going to form your bias. And we have to understand where we all come from. Martin Luther King once said, I have a dream that my children will be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. But before you can know my character, you have to know who I am. So that means that you have to spend some time walking with me, talking with me, and understanding where my collective energy has come from and what synergy eludes from me and for why. So it's going to take personal relationships. Like I told someone else the other day, if you don't have a black friend, get a black friend. Find anybody. Find that person in your apartment building that you've been dodging and not wanting to talk to. Bring somebody to dinner. Have lunch with someone. Find out what they're thinking. Sit down with them for a while and not just make it a 10 or 15 minute jaunt and say, okay, I've done that. Let's talk about the long haul. Let's talk in relationship very deliberately a year out. Let's plan monthly meetings, weekly meetings, and continue with this dialogue. That's where we start with understanding how to deal with each other as people and those collective biases that we all have.
Reverend, I wanted to ask you about, there's been so many interesting takes, and Brenda and I were talking about this morning, and I'd love to know kind of where you fall on this. We were talking earlier this morning with Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, and over the weekend at a press conference, she was really, imploring people at these demonstrations, please don't mix our message with, vandalism or destruction that you see. I watched CNN late into the night of protests around the country, and I watched a great clip from the rapper and activist Killer Mike in Atlanta. The police chief there brought him in, and he had one of the best speeches that I've seen, crying. His father is an Atlanta cop, his cousin is an Atlanta cop. He feels, he's right in the mix of this. But he said, do not burn our house down. Do not burn Atlanta down because you are trying to get this message across. You can do the most good. And he started by saying, fill out the census. Let people know that you're here and we can get, funds and attention to the places that need it. And then go to the voting booth. What's kind of your thoughts on that? Because it really is a conflict kind of mentally.
I echo the same sentiment. I believe that we have to start with the conversation as to why. Number one, why are we here? Well, 400 years of oppression and suppression only makes the heart sick. We talk about hope deferred making our heart sick. Well, when we've been, when there's been a candle dangled in front of our faces for 400 years and we still haven't been able to catch the carrot, you're going to be enraged. So the rage is understandable. The rage is a message that says, I've been left out and I'm not included. But the answer isn't in looting and destroying. The answer is in understanding and giving me something to eat. We teach people how to fish and they live forever. But if we just continue to give them a fish, then they're only going to eat as much as we give them. Bring us to the table. Allow us to be a part of the economic reprise that is necessary for sustainability in the community. We need to be stakeholders. We need to be people with an equal voice. Equity and inclusion is a must.
And I do want to say really quickly, right at the beginning of our conversation, people couldn't hear us on YouTube and Facebook. We obviously have that audio up right now. We've been rolling and we've been able to obviously hear you, Reverend, the whole time. So we are going to post this whole conversation afterwards if people missed the very top. But Drew, I know you had a question next. Go ahead.
Well, we're trying to give you a voice this morning, Reverend. So having the audio helps give you that voice. We have it all cleared up now, though. Let me ask you, because I feel over the weekend I read some things, heard some things that made me feel like coming out and saying, I'm disgusted by that behavior in downtown Portland or in city XYZ over the weekend, the looting, the rioting. I'm disgusted by that behavior. Quickly met with, well, then if you're focusing on that, you're missing the point. And I feel like, can I be equally disgusted by the actions in Minnesota from last Monday with not just the officer that kneeled down on George Floyd's neck, but the other three officers that stood around did nothing? I was disgusted by what I saw there. But then I was also, I'm not saying equally, but I was also disgusted by some of the behavior I saw in our city and cities around the country, people destroying businesses, setting things on fire. Can I have both feelings? Is that not okay?
Of course it's okay. Well, the reality is there has been looting. The reality is that there has been destruction. Where that's come from, we don't know. I do know this, that what my eyes have seen, it doesn't look like people, it doesn't seem to look like people that look like me in this city, especially, that is doing that. But however, understanding that rage and understanding that need for that outlet is one thing. But knowing that there's a divide that says, this is as far as you can go with that. No, I don't agree with the looting and I don't agree with the destruction, but I do understand the message. And the message is, we're tired. The message is, we want a voice. The message is, we want to be heard. The message is, we don't want any more promises. We want action, and we want action now. You know, for over 50 years, we thought that with the Civil Rights Act, that it was going to be better. We were made to seem, we thought it was better by us getting the some of the stimuluses that have come with that package from that time on. But we've got to remember this. Our clarion criers for freedom were murdered in that same era, and then the movement kind of died. So we looked for a long time for that same voice that we thought we'd overcome, and we find out now that we haven't. And I'll tell you this, President Trump gave us a real precious gift when he became president of the United States. He allowed us to look at who we are, where we are right now, and he uncovered the veil of real racism in this country.
Interesting that you bring up President Trump, so I'll go ahead and go there because our country is, you know, kind of evenly split, just for now, I'll say 50-50. But how are we and how are you and how are the people on, I say we as in the media, how are the people on the other side going to come together? How do you reach those people? They may be in your family, we talked about that, but how do you reach the other half of the country who feels vehemently that they are right, that they are absolutely appalled at what's happening in the streets?
They would be correct in being appalled by the action, but they would be remiss not to understand why. So I believe that the conversation needs to be, why are we here? How did we get here? And how do we begin to make this heal? Where do we bridge the gap? How do we close that divide? And again, it becomes with immediate legislature, what we can do right now, what we can insist on right now, and how we can make those changes and build to the greater changes that we want to see.
In that Killer Mike speech that I was talking to you about, he actually gave a great example of something that we could do right now, and that's bring back like community review boards to police departments to look at some of these problem officers that, you know, maybe have done, you know, wrong a couple of different times, and don't let it get to that point of where we saw with George Floyd. What do you kind of think about that nationwide for police departments, and how do you kind of think Portland police have been doing recently?
Well, I'm very proud of our police force here. they've made extraordinary strides. And something that I need to remind people of all the time is police officers are not our enemy. They're our friends. These are our brothers, our sisters. They're our church members. These people are the same folks that we intermingle with in other social settings. They're people. So it's not the police in itself that is the problem. It is the underlying temperament of the police and the fraternal organization that they are and how tight that is. But you mentioned the community review boards. Yes. What happened to those? And I think that we're going to have to go back to those. 19 offenses and only 2 investigations is a huge indicator as to what is right and what is wrong. How do you get to 19 violations and still be allowed to perform as a police officer? That isn't a training problem. That is a legislative problem. And that is a problem with process and procedure in our systems.
Reverend, you remember the civil rights movements of the 1960s. You remember the speeches made by Dr. Martin Luther King. All these years later now, are you surprised that we're only where we are and we haven't moved further than we have?
No, I'm not surprised at all. Sleight of hand, as we see from our current administration, has always been the order of the day. Trickery is disgusting. You know, when we go back to systems, we go back to the United States Constitution, which is a borrowed document from Britain. And then after the Civil War, when we made the Bill of Rights, we need to understand that we need to bring back the intention of those bills and what they were intended for. That's why it's very important to take Black people out of the POC pool, the people of color pool. It was the civil rights that brought us to the understanding that Blacks were not at the table. We weren't eating that piece of the American pie that was cut out for us. We're going to have to go back and look at that and say, how do we make reparations to this community, and how do we start right now? And we start by listening and understanding that it hasn't been inclusive and it hasn't been equitable. So we have to understand where our mistakes have been, is to say, we haven't included your community.
Can you give me a couple specifics from where you sit with the NAACP about what you and your organization will do from here on out to broaden the conversation and to institute change? What's on your radar? Well,
we have a big gathering of the Asian community with the African American community, with the local NAACP. We're going to sit down and talk to our Asian constituencies about our divide there. To continue to have community listening sessions and understanding about where is that divide and how can it be more equitable. Who can we bring to the conversation? So we're joining forces with other organizations like the Coalition of Black Men and the Urban League and places like that, where we're sitting down together talking about how we can engage with our constituency that is on the other side of the fence and bring about a better change.
And I was just curious, in all the folks that you talk with here locally, how has the, I mean, so many people are out of work, right now because of coronavirus. So we have that. We have the, just constantly being inside or, having to stay home and not. And I just feel like, what did you kind of notice with the stay-at-home thing for so many months and, just the record joblessness? And then we had in the same week, the video that went viral of the woman in Central Park calling the police on a bird watcher. I mean, it was just like snowballing, it seemed like, even before, last Monday when we saw the George Floyd tape. Kind of talk about that buildup a little bit.
Well, I tell you, boy, so many thoughts bombard my mind. When we talk about, I just went to a blank, but when we talk about, what was your question again?
I just wonder, is this part of the reason why we see so many cities taking to the streets, white, black, Asian, Hispanic, everyone, we've all been cooped up. We're all at like peak, exhaustion and stress. And then you have, first this, ridiculous Central Park thing with this woman, and then you have George Floyd's death, and it just is like a bomb went off almost.
Well, what it is it's racism right here in our face. And it's given us an opportunity to look at again what is real. So I believe that there's a reset button that has been set. I don't think that we're ever going to go back to what is norm or what we know as the norm. I think that we are being forced to have the conversations that are necessary to move the needle forward. Well, we didn't see it like we thought we did, like I said, in the last 50 years or so, but now we're here. So we're forced to make the changes that are right here in our face, and we can't escape.
Reverend Mondaine, you know, the average human should get about 8 hours of sleep a night, which means Friday, Saturday, and last night, you should have gotten about 24 hours of sleep. How many hours of sleep would you say you've gotten over the last 3 nights?
Probably about 7.
Yeah.
This has been disturbing, and to say the least, it's been a roller coaster ride of emotions, to say, wow, to say the least. I've never seen this. I'm over 60 years old now, and I've never seen this kind of unrest in my entire life. I was there in Ferguson when that uprising happened. I was there on many occasions. And it's interesting that right there at the spot where Mike Brown was killed, just 3 miles from there is the grave of Dred Scott, which was the pivotal point that started our Civil War. So we again looked at what racism was in Ferguson, and we're seeing it escalate even to now. And what's happening over and over again, it says, we're not at the table, we're not being included, we're the first affected and the last informed.
E.D. Mondaine, president of the NAACP. We're committed here at KGW to keeping this conversation going. We appreciate you being part of it, and we invite you back when we do go to the next level. Thank you so much this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. If I can have the last word, become a member of the NAACP.
There you go.
Get involved. Go to the NAACP's website and sign up, join, tell us your thoughts. Come to our meetings. Let's have some conversation about what we can do together to make the change.
Reverend, thank you. We are out of time. That'll do it for us here on Sunrise Extra.